Lady Evangeline's beauty was legendary, but her husband's misfortune was even more famous. 7 marriages, 7 deaths. No one noticed that she became wealthier with each widowhood. The morning fog rolled across the grounds of Thornfield Manor as Lady Evangeline Blackwood stood at her bedroom window, dressed in the finest black silk that money could buy. At 32, she had perfected the art of mourning. Her pale complexion seemed luminous against the dark fabric, while her golden hair was arranged in an elegant chignon that suggested both grief and resilience. The funeral cortege that wound its way through the village below represented the final chapter of her most recent matrimonial adventure. Lord Charles Blackwood had been a generous husband during their brief 6-month marriage, showering her with gifts and affection while remaining blissfully unaware that his days were numbered from the moment they exchanged vows. His death from sudden heart failure had shocked the medical community, as he had been in perfect health just weeks before, but Evangeline's grief had been so profound and beautifully displayed that no one had questioned the tragic coincidence. The transformation of Evangeline from impoverished orphan to one of England's wealthiest widows had been a masterpiece of careful planning and flawless execution that spanned nearly 15 years. Her first marriage at 17 had been born of desperation rather than love, a union with elderly Lord William Ashford that had rescued her from the workhouse while providing her with an education in the finer aspects of aristocratic life. Lord William's death after just 8 months of marriage had been attributed to his advanced age and poor health, leaving his young widow with modest inheritance and valuable social connections. The methods that Evangeline employed to eliminate her husbands had been refined through years of careful experimentation and observation, evolving from crude poisoning attempts to sophisticated techniques that produced deaths so natural in appearance that even the most suspicious physicians found no cause for concern. Her knowledge of herbs, chemistry, and human physiology had been acquired through discreet consultations with practitioners whose services extended beyond conventional medical care. Lord Henry Pemberton, her second husband, had provided valuable lessons in the art of gradual elimination that avoided the suspicious timing that had characterized Lord William's demise. Henry's death had been achieved through a carefully orchestrated decline that spanned 4 months, beginning with minor digestive complaints that gradually progressed to complete system failure. The extended timeline had enabled Evangeline to establish herself as a devoted wife whose tireless nursing efforts had enhanced rather than diminished her reputation for virtue and dedication. The inheritance that had followed Henry's death had provided Evangeline with resources that enabled her to expand her operations while refining her techniques through access to better equipment and more exotic materials. Her transformation from struggling widow to woman of independent means had attracted suitors whose wealth exceeded anything her previous experience had prepared her to exploit, creating opportunities for advancement that justified the risks involved in increasingly ambitious matrimonial ventures. Duke Richard Fairfax had represented her entry into the highest levels of aristocratic society, a marriage that elevated her social position while providing access to resources that enabled systematic expansion of her elimination capabilities. The Duke's passion for exotic travel had provided perfect cover for acquiring rare botanical specimens and chemical compounds that could produce effects unavailable through conventional means, while his extensive library had contained texts that described applications of such materials that conventional medicine would never acknowledge. Richard's death during their honeymoon in Egypt had been attributed to tropical diseases that claimed many European travelers who ventured too far from civilized medical care. The exotic circumstances of his demise had actually enhanced Evangeline's reputation as a tragic figure whose romantic adventures had been cut short by fate rather than design, while the substantial inheritance she received had established her as one of England's most eligible widows. The publicity that surrounded the Duke's death had attracted attention from suitors whose previous hesitation about marrying such a conspicuously unlucky woman had been overcome by her demonstrated resilience and the romantic appeal of someone who had survived such dramatic losses. Count Alessandro Montague had pursued her with Italian passion that had made their whirlwind courtship the talk of London society, while his vast Mediterranean estates had promised adventures that would rival anything her previous marriages had provided. Alessandro's death from complications following a riding accident had occurred just weeks after their return from an extended honeymoon in Venice, timing that reinforced the pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow Evangeline despite her obvious devotion to her husband's welfare. The grief she displayed at his funeral had been so convincing that several witnesses had expressed concern for her health, while the inheritance documentation had revealed the full extent of the Count's generosity in providing for his beloved wife's future security. Lord Marcus Whitmore had approached their courtship with the analytical mind that had made him successful in banking and finance, conducting discreet investigations into Evangeline's background that had revealed the statistical improbability of her repeated widowhood while finding no evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. His conclusion that she was simply the victim of extraordinary bad luck had been reinforced by her obvious reluctance to remarry and the genuine affection she displayed during their extended engagement. Marcus's death from sudden stroke had been particularly shocking, given his relatively young age and excellent health, but the medical consensus had attributed the tragedy to hereditary factors that could not have been predicted or prevented. Evangeline's inheritance had included not only his personal wealth, but also controlling interests in several major commercial enterprises that transformed her from wealthy widow to industrial magnate, with influence extending far beyond purely social circles. The pattern of Evangeline's marriages had begun attracting attention from observers whose analytical capabilities exceeded those of conventional society gossips, though the absence of any obvious criminal evidence had prevented such suspicions from developing into formal investigations. Her reputation for bad luck had actually enhanced her appeal to certain types of men who believed that their superior health, intelligence, or spiritual protection would enable them to succeed where others had failed. Sir Edward Thornton had represented the most challenging target yet, as his military background and suspicious nature had made him naturally resistant to the kinds of subtle manipulation that had proven effective with previous husbands. His courtship had required developing new approaches that could overcome his defensive instincts while exploiting the pride and competitiveness that had driven his successful career in colonial administration. Edward's death from tropical fever contracted during their honeymoon in India had been entirely consistent with medical knowledge about diseases that affected European visitors to such climates, while the extended nature of his illness had provided ample opportunity for Evangeline to demonstrate the devoted nursing care that had characterized all her marriages. The inheritance documentation had revealed that his military pension and colonial investments had been supplemented by careful management that had multiplied his wealth substantially during their brief marriage. The accumulation of wealth that had resulted from Evangeline's matrimonial career had enabled her to establish herself as one of England's most influential women, with financial resources that exceeded those of many hereditary aristocrats and social connections that extended throughout the highest levels of society. Her transformation from workhouse orphan to industrial magnate had been achieved through methods that left no legal evidence, while demonstrating capabilities that transcended anything conventional crime could accomplish. Lord Charles Blackwood had been selected as her final matrimonial victim, not because of any intention to retire from her criminal career, but because his death would provide resources sufficient to fund operations that extended far beyond individual assassinations into realms of systematic social manipulation that could reshape entire power structures according to her will. The funeral that marked the end of her seventh marriage had been attended by representatives of the highest levels of government and commerce, reflecting both her social position and the influence that her accumulated wealth had provided. Her grief had been performed with the expertise that came from years of practice, while her beauty had been enhanced rather than diminished by the mourning attire that emphasized her vulnerability while concealing the predatory intelligence that had enabled her remarkable success. As the funeral cortege disappeared into the distance, Evangeline had begun planning the next phase of her career, which would involve applications of her matrimonial techniques on a scale that would make her previous achievements seem modest by comparison. The husband collector had completed her basic education in the arts of acquisition and elimination, and was now prepared to attempt challenges that would test the full extent of her capabilities. The transformation of Evangeline from naive orphan to master manipulator had been accomplished through systematic study of male psychology and careful observation of the weaknesses that could be exploited to achieve complete control over even the most intelligent and successful men. Her education in the arts of seduction had begun during her first marriage, when necessity had forced her to develop techniques for managing Lord William's suspicions while establishing herself as an indispensable source of comfort and care. The foundation of Evangeline's approach lay in understanding that successful men possessed egos that required constant validation, combined with insecurities that they would go to extraordinary lengths to conceal from the world. Her beauty provided initial access to potential victims, but her ability to identify and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities had enabled her to achieve levels of control that physical attraction alone could never accomplish. Lord William Ashford had taught her that elderly men's fear of death could be transformed into protective devotion toward young wives, who appeared to offer renewed vitality and purpose to lives that had begun to feel increasingly meaningless. Her apparent innocence and genuine gratitude for his rescue from poverty had created emotional bonds that made him eager to please her, while viewing any concerns about her motives as evidence of his own unworthy suspicions about someone so obviously pure and loving. The techniques that Evangeline had developed for accelerating Lord William's death had emerged from careful observation of his habits, health concerns, and the medications that his physicians had prescribed for various age-related ailments. Her innocent questions about his treatments had been presented as loving concern for his welfare, while her suggestions for additional remedies had drawn upon folklore and traditional medicine that seemed harmless but could produce dangerous interactions with his existing prescriptions. Lord William's death had been achieved through a carefully orchestrated combination of herbal supplements that she had convinced him were beneficial for maintaining vigor, while actually creating conditions that would exacerbate his existing heart problems until cardiac failure became inevitable. The gradual nature of his decline had prevented anyone from connecting his worsening health to the devoted care that his young wife provided, while her grief at his passing had been enhanced by genuine relief that her first experiment in matrimonial murder had succeeded without detection. The lessons learned from Lord William's elimination had informed Evangeline's approach to Lord Henry Pemberton, whose robust health and suspicious nature had required more sophisticated methods that could overcome his natural resistance to accepting help from someone whose motives he questioned. Her courtship had involved systematic research into his business interests, social connections, and personal history that enabled her to present herself as someone who could enhance rather than threaten his established lifestyle. Henry's weakness had proven to be his pride and intellectual superiority over women, a prejudice that made him dismiss her apparent intelligence while being flattered by her requests for guidance on matters that he considered beyond feminine understanding. Her questions about his work, investments, and future plans had been presented as eager desire to learn from his expertise, while actually providing information that enabled her to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited during their marriage. The poisoning method that had eliminated Lord Henry had involved chemicals that she had acquired through suppliers who believed they were providing materials for textile dyeing and botanical experimentation, legitimate hobbies that wealthy women often pursued as artistic diversions. The compounds had been integrated into his meals through cooking techniques that she had learned from discreet consultations with practitioners whose knowledge extended beyond conventional culinary arts. Henry's death had demonstrated that even suspicious and intelligent men could be manipulated through careful attention to their psychological needs and systematic exploitation of the trust that marriage encouraged them to develop. His willingness to consume food prepared by his loving wife had provided perfect opportunities for administering substances that produced symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness, while the extended timeline of his decline had enabled her to establish alibis that deflected any potential suspicion about external causes. Duke Richard Fairfax had presented more complex challenges due to his extensive travel experience and sophisticated understanding of international politics that made him naturally cautious about accepting anything at face value. His courtship had required developing entirely new approaches that could appeal to his adventurous nature, while exploiting his romantic idealization of women who appeared to share his passion for exotic experiences and cultural exploration. Richard's vulnerability had been his desire to find a partner whose intelligence and curiosity matched his own, combined with loneliness that resulted from years of travel that had prevented him from forming lasting emotional connections. Evangeline's ability to discuss art, literature, and philosophy with apparent expertise had convinced him that she possessed the intellectual depth necessary for genuine partnership, while her beauty and apparent devotion had fulfilled romantic fantasies that his previous relationships had failed to satisfy. The elimination method that had claimed Duke Richard had involved rare tropical plants that she had acquired during their honeymoon travels, specimens that produced effects indistinguishable from diseases that commonly affected European visitors to exotic climates. Her knowledge of these botanical weapons had been gained through discreet consultations with local practitioners whose expertise in traditional medicine included applications that conventional physicians would never acknowledge. Richard's death had confirmed that even experienced and worldly men could be vulnerable to techniques that exploited their emotional needs while appearing to fulfill their deepest desires for intellectual and romantic connection. His complete trust in her expertise regarding local customs and remedies had provided opportunities for administering substances that produced symptoms consistent with tropical diseases, while her obvious grief at losing such an ideal husband had enhanced rather than diminished her reputation for virtue and devotion. Count Alessandro Montague had required yet another approach, as his Italian background and passionate temperament had made him resistant to the intellectual appeals that had proven effective with English aristocrats. His courtship had involved systematic study of Mediterranean culture and romantic traditions that enabled her to present herself as someone who could appreciate and reciprocate the emotional intensity that characterized his approach to relationships. Alessandro's weakness had been his belief that passionate love could overcome any obstacle, combined with cultural assumptions about feminine purity that made him dismiss practical considerations about Evangeline's previous marriages as irrelevant to their spiritual connection. Her ability to match his emotional intensity while appearing to be transformed by their love had convinced him that she represented the romantic ideal that he had been seeking throughout his adult life. The method used for Alessandro's elimination had involved mechanical sabotage rather than chemical poisoning, as his robust health and active lifestyle had made him resistant to subtle biological interventions. Her knowledge of his riding habits had enabled her to arrange circumstances that would produce an accident that appeared entirely natural, while ensuring fatal results that could not be attributed to external intervention. Lord Marcus Whitmore had presented the greatest intellectual challenge yet, as his analytical background in banking and finance had made him naturally inclined to investigate patterns and identify inconsistencies that might reveal hidden agendas. His courtship had required developing psychological profiles that could predict his responses while creating emotional bonds strong enough to override his professional instincts for caution and verification. Marcus's vulnerability had been his belief that rational analysis could protect him from emotional manipulation, combined with loneliness that resulted from dedicating most of his energy to business pursuits that had provided financial success but limited personal satisfaction. Evangeline's apparent appreciation for his intellectual achievements had fulfilled needs that his professional success had never addressed, while her beauty and devotion had provided emotional rewards that his analytical mind had difficulty quantifying or questioning. The elimination technique that had claimed Marcus had involved inducing stroke through chemical compounds that affected blood flow to the brain while leaving no detectable traces in post-mortem examination. Her access to his medical records had enabled her to identify genetic predispositions that could be exploited through substances that would exacerbate existing vulnerabilities until cerebral hemorrhage became inevitable. Sir Edward Thornton had required military-style planning due to his professional background in intelligence and security that had taught him to recognize and counter various forms of deception and manipulation. His courtship had involved creating false identities and fabricated backgrounds that could withstand the kind of investigation that his suspicious nature would inevitably conduct, while appealing to his protective instincts through apparent vulnerability that masked her true capabilities. Edward's weakness had been his professional pride in being able to identify and counter threats, combined with romantic idealization of feminine fragility that made him eager to provide protection and guidance to women who appeared to need his expertise. Evangeline's performance as someone who required his protection while secretly possessing capabilities that exceeded his own had enabled her to achieve complete control while reinforcing his conviction that he was the dominant partner in their relationship. The method that had eliminated Sir Edward had involved tropical diseases that she had deliberately contracted and then transmitted to him through intimate contact, using her own temporary illness as cover for introducing pathogens that would prove fatal to someone without her carefully developed immunities. Her recovery while his condition deteriorated had been attributed to gender differences and constitutional factors that medical knowledge of the time could not adequately explain. Lord Charles Blackwood had represented the culmination of Evangeline's education in matrimonial murder, as his combination of wealth, intelligence, and social position had required integrating all the techniques that she had developed through previous marriages, while avoiding the patterns that might eventually attract attention from authorities, whose investigative capabilities exceeded those of conventional law enforcement. Charles's elimination had been accomplished through methods so sophisticated that even deliberate investigation would have found no evidence of external intervention, while his death had provided her with resources sufficient to fund operations that transcended individual assassinations to encompass systematic social manipulation on a scale that could reshape entire power structures according to her will. The art of seduction that Evangeline had perfected through 7 marriages had evolved far beyond simple manipulation to become a comprehensive system for identifying, targeting, and eliminating individuals whose resources could serve her larger objectives while maintaining perfect cover for activities that conventional crime could never accomplish. Her success had proven that the most effective predators were those who appeared to be ideal victims, and that the deadliest weapons were those that seemed to be acts of love. The expansion of Evangeline's operations beyond individual matrimonial murders to encompass systematic wealth acquisition had required developing networks of associates who could provide specialized services while remaining ignorant of the full scope of her activities. Her transformation from serial bride to criminal mastermind had been accomplished through careful recruitment of individuals whose skills complemented her own capabilities, while ensuring that no single person possessed enough information to threaten her security. The establishment of Thornfield Manor as her base of operations had provided cover for activities that extended far beyond the domestic arrangements that society expected from even the wealthiest widows. The estate's extensive grounds had been modified to include facilities that appeared to serve innocent purposes while actually supporting operations that required specialized equipment and complete privacy from outside observation. Dr. Marcus Ashworth had been among the first professionals to be recruited into Evangeline's expanding organization, his medical expertise providing access to pharmaceutical knowledge and chemical supplies that enabled more sophisticated assassination techniques, while maintaining perfect cover for activities that appeared to involve legitimate research into women's health issues. His financial difficulties and professional disappointments had made him receptive to opportunities that conventional practice could never provide. The consultation that had led to Dr. Ashworth's recruitment had taken place under the guise of seeking treatment for the nervous conditions that wealthy widows commonly experienced, while actually serving as an extended interview process that enabled Evangeline to assess his capabilities and vulnerabilities. His willingness to provide experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of conventional medicine had demonstrated the flexibility that would make him valuable for projects that required absolute discretion. Dr. Ashworth's first assignment had involved developing compounds that could produce heart failure in healthy subjects while leaving no chemical traces that post-mortem examination could detect, a challenge that appealed to his scientific curiosity while providing solutions to Evangeline's operational requirements. His success in creating such substances had confirmed his value while establishing precedents for cooperation that would extend to increasingly ambitious projects. Lady Catherine Pemberton had been recruited to provide social intelligence and access to aristocratic circles whose internal dynamics Evangeline needed to understand in order to identify suitable targets for future matrimonial ventures. Catherine's position as a respected hostess and her extensive knowledge of family histories, financial circumstances, and personal relationships had made her an invaluable source of information about potential victims. Catherine's recruitment had been accomplished through systematic exploitation of her gambling debts and social insecurities, vulnerabilities that made her dependent on Evangeline's financial support, while ensuring her cooperation in activities that she gradually came to understand served purposes that extended beyond mere social assistance. Her willingness to provide detailed intelligence about her social circle had demonstrated loyalty that warranted additional responsibilities and privileges within the organization. The intelligence network that Catherine had helped to establish had enabled Evangeline to identify Lord Geoffrey Ashford as an ideal target for her next matrimonial venture, while providing detailed information about his business interests, family relationships, and personal habits that would inform the approach required to achieve successful seduction and elimination. Geoffrey's wealth exceeded that of her previous husband's, while his known health problems would provide perfect cover for deaths that appeared to result from natural causes. Lord Geoffrey's courtship had proceeded according to plans that had been developed through months of careful study and preparation, with every aspect of their relationship choreographed to reinforce his conviction that Evangeline represented the romantic ideal that he had been seeking throughout his adult life. His proposal had been achieved within the timeline that her operational requirements demanded, while the prenuptial arrangements had been structured to ensure maximum financial benefit from his eventual elimination. The wedding that had marked Evangeline's eighth marriage had been celebrated with festivities that reflected both Geoffrey's generous nature and his desire to demonstrate his happiness to a society that had begun to whisper about the statistical improbability of his bride's repeated widowhood. The ceremony had been attended by representatives of the highest levels of government and commerce, reflecting the social position that her accumulated wealth and influence had achieved. Geoffrey's elimination had been accomplished through methods that represented the pinnacle of Evangeline's technical sophistication, involving substances that produced symptoms indistinguishable from the progression of existing medical conditions, while ensuring death occurred within the timeline required by her operational schedule. His demise after just 4 months of marriage had been attributed to complications from hereditary ailments that his family history had made inevitable, while Evangeline's grief had been enhanced by apparent shock at losing another beloved husband to forces beyond human control. The inheritance that had followed Geoffrey's death had provided Evangeline with resources that exceeded the combined wealth of all her previous matrimonial victims, establishing her as one of England's richest individuals while enabling expansion of her operations into territories that conventional criminal enterprises could never attempt. Her transformation from husband collector to industrial magnate had been completed through systematic application of matrimonial murder techniques that left no legal evidence while demonstrating capabilities that transcended anything that ordinary crime could accomplish. Lady Victoria Ashworth had been the next addition to Evangeline's organization, her expertise in chemical research providing capabilities that complemented Dr. Ashworth's medical knowledge while enabling development of assassination techniques that pushed the boundaries of what contemporary science could achieve. Victoria's recruitment had been accomplished through appeals to her intellectual vanity and her desire to participate in research that would advance human knowledge beyond the limitations of conventional academic constraints. Victoria's first project had involved developing compounds that could be administered through cosmetic preparations, enabling elimination of targets who might be resistant to more conventional poisoning methods, while maintaining perfect cover for activities that appeared to involve routine beauty treatments. Her success in creating such substances had opened new possibilities for assassination techniques that could be applied to victims who would never accept food or beverages from potentially hostile sources. The expansion of Evangeline's organization had continued throughout the London social season, with each new recruitment adding capabilities that enhanced her ability to identify, target, and eliminate individuals whose resources could serve her larger objectives. The network that had grown around her matrimonial career had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated through legitimate businesses while serving purposes that transcended conventional understanding of organized crime. Lord Edmund Fairfax had been selected as Evangeline's ninth matrimonial victim, not only because of his substantial wealth, but because his elimination would provide access to government contracts and political connections that could enable operations extending far beyond individual assassinations into realms of systematic social manipulation that could reshape entire power structures according to her will. Edmund's courtship had required developing new approaches that could appeal to his political ambitions, while exploiting his desire to marry someone whose social position and financial resources would enhance his prospects for advancement within government circles. His conviction that their marriage would provide mutual benefits that justified overlooking concerns about her previous matrimonial history had enabled Evangeline to achieve engagement within the aggressive timeline that her operational requirements demanded. The wedding that had celebrated Evangeline's ninth marriage had been attended by representatives of the highest levels of government, reflecting both Edmund's political connections and the social position that her accumulated wealth had achieved. The ceremony had provided opportunities for establishing relationships with officials whose cooperation would be essential for future operations that required government protection from investigation or interference. Edmund's elimination had been accomplished through methods that demonstrated the full sophistication of Evangeline's technical capabilities, involving compounds that produced symptoms indistinguishable from political stress and overwork, while ensuring death occurred during circumstances that would enhance rather than diminish her reputation for devotion and virtue. His demise after just 6 months of marriage had been attributed to the pressures of public service that had proven too demanding for his constitution, while Evangeline's grief had been enhanced by apparent determination to continue his work through charitable activities that would honor his memory. The inheritance that had followed Edmund's death had included not only his personal wealth, but also access to government contracts and political relationships that transformed Evangeline from wealthy widow to political power broker, whose influence extended throughout the highest levels of national administration. Her success had demonstrated that matrimonial murder could serve strategic objectives that transcended mere financial gain to encompass systematic acquisition of political control that could reshape society according to her will. Count Vittorio Montague had been recruited as Evangeline's international representative, his Italian background and continental connections providing access to European assassination markets that could extend her influence beyond English boundaries, while generating revenues that would fund increasingly ambitious operations. His recruitment had been accomplished through appeals to his criminal ambitions and his desire to participate in enterprises that offered opportunities for advancement that legitimate businesses could never provide. The network that Evangeline had established through 9 successful marriages had evolved into an international organization that operated through legitimate businesses while serving criminal purposes that transcended conventional understanding of organized crime. Her success had proven that the most effective criminal enterprises were those that appeared to serve humanitarian purposes while actually advancing objectives that conventional law enforcement could never detect or counter. The husband collector had achieved transformation from individual predator to criminal mastermind, whose organization commanded resources and influence that enabled operations extending far beyond anything that traditional crime could accomplish. Her collection had grown to encompass not only accumulated wealth from matrimonial murders, but also networks of associates whose specialized capabilities enabled systematic social manipulation on a scale that could reshape entire political and economic structures according to her will. The ultimate test of Evangeline's criminal enterprise had come when she attracted the attention of Inspector Jonathan Whitmore, whose reputation for solving impossible cases had made him the Metropolitan Police's most feared investigator. His interest in the statistical anomaly of her repeated widowhood had been triggered by insurance company inquiries about the substantial claims that had followed each of her marriages, creating the first serious threat to operations that had remained undetected for over 15 years. Inspector Whitmore's investigation had begun with careful analysis of death certificates, medical records, and financial documents that revealed patterns, suggesting something far more sinister than simple bad luck. His background in statistical analysis had enabled him to calculate that the probability of 7 healthy men dying within years of marrying the same woman was so remote as to be effectively impossible, while his examination of the timing and circumstances of each death had revealed subtle consistencies that indicated systematic planning rather than natural coincidence. The challenge that Inspector Whitmore represented had required Evangeline to develop entirely new approaches that could neutralize a threat whose professional competence exceeded anything her previous experience had prepared her to counter. His reputation for persistence and analytical precision had made conventional intimidation or misdirection ineffective, while his personal integrity had rendered him immune to the financial inducements that might have influenced less dedicated investigators. Evangeline's solution had involved systematic study of Inspector Whitmore's personal circumstances, professional relationships, and psychological profile that enabled her to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited despite his formidable professional capabilities. His dedication to his work had created personal isolation that made him susceptible to social manipulation, while his pride in intellectual superiority had provided openings for approaches that appeared to acknowledge his expertise while actually serving her objectives. The campaign that Evangeline had designed to neutralize Inspector Whitmore had involved creating circumstances that would discredit his investigation while eliminating him as a threat to her continued operations. Her approach had required coordinating multiple elements including false evidence, fabricated witnesses, and systematic manipulation of his professional relationships that would make his superiors question both his competence and his objectivity. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been assigned to establish social contact with Inspector Whitmore under the guise of seeking his assistance with personal security concerns that appeared unrelated to Evangeline's activities. Margaret's beauty and apparent vulnerability had been designed to appeal to his protective instincts while providing opportunities for gathering intelligence about his investigation and the evidence he had accumulated against her employer. The relationship that had developed between Margaret and Inspector Whitmore had exceeded Evangeline's expectations, as his genuine attraction to her apparent innocence and intelligence had created emotional bonds that could be exploited to achieve levels of control that mere professional interaction could never provide. His willingness to discuss his work with someone who seemed to appreciate his intellectual achievements had provided access to confidential information about his investigation. Dr. Ashworth had been assigned to establish professional contact with Inspector Whitmore's personal physician, Henry Pemberton, whose cooperation would be essential for implementing the medical aspects of the plan that would eliminate the inspector while maintaining cover that would prevent his death from being connected to Evangeline's activities. The approach had involved offering collaborative research opportunities that would appeal to Dr. Pemberton's intellectual vanity while providing access to the inspector's medical records. The elimination method that had been selected for Inspector Whitmore had represented the culmination of Evangeline's technical sophistication, involving compounds that would produce symptoms indistinguishable from stress-related illness, while ensuring death occurred during circumstances that would enhance rather than diminish the credibility of explanations, attributing his demise to overwork and professional pressure. The implementation of Inspector Whitmore's elimination had required precise coordination between multiple operatives whose activities had to be synchronized to ensure optimal results, while maintaining perfect cover for the systematic murder that would remove the greatest threat that Evangeline's organization had ever faced. Margaret's relationship with the inspector had provided opportunities for administering substances that would begin the elimination process, while Dr. Pemberton's medical care had enabled acceleration of symptoms until fatal complications became inevitable. Inspector Whitmore's death from apparent heart failure, brought on by professional stress, had been accepted by his superiors as a tragic but unsurprising consequence of his dedication to challenging cases that had proven too demanding for even his exceptional capabilities. His investigation into Evangeline's activities had been quietly discontinued, while his accumulated evidence had been filed as the incomplete work of a dedicated officer whose death had prevented him from reaching the conclusions that might have validated his suspicions. The successful elimination of Inspector Whitmore had demonstrated that Evangeline's organization possessed capabilities that enabled neutralization of even the most competent opposition while maintaining perfect cover for activities that conventional law enforcement could never detect or counter. Her success had proven that the most effective criminal enterprises were those that appeared to operate within legal boundaries while actually serving purposes that transcended conventional understanding of organized crime. Lord Reginald Ashford had been selected as Evangeline's 10th and final matrimonial victim, not because of any intention to retire from criminal activities, but because his elimination would provide resources sufficient to fund operations that extended far beyond individual assassinations into realms of systematic social control that could reshape entire civilizations according to her will. His wealth exceeded that of all her previous husbands combined, while his political connections would provide access to international networks that could enable global expansion of her organization. Reginald's courtship had represented the ultimate test of Evangeline's seductive capabilities, as his intelligence, experience, and natural suspicion had made him resistant to the techniques that had proven effective with previous victims. His awareness of her matrimonial history had required developing entirely new approaches that could acknowledge the statistical anomaly of her repeated widowhood while convincing him that their love was strong enough to overcome whatever forces had claimed her previous husbands. The psychological manipulation that had achieved Reginald's proposal had involved systematic exploitation of his competitive nature and his belief that his superior intelligence and physical fitness would protect him from whatever fate had befallen his predecessors. His conviction that he could succeed where others had failed had enabled Evangeline to achieve engagement, despite his obvious awareness of the risks involved in marrying someone with her history. The wedding that had celebrated Evangeline's 10th marriage had been the social event of the decade, attended by representatives of royal families throughout Europe and reflecting the international influence that her accumulated wealth and political connections had achieved. Reginald's elimination had been accomplished through methods that demonstrated the absolute perfection of Evangeline's technical capabilities, involving substances that produced symptoms indistinguishable from genetic conditions that his family history had made predictable, while ensuring death occurred during their honeymoon in circumstances that would enhance rather than diminish international sympathy for her tragic loss. The organization that had grown around Evangeline's matrimonial career had evolved into an international network that operated through legitimate businesses while serving criminal purposes that included assassination, political manipulation, and systematic social control on a scale that could reshape entire civilizations according to her will. Her success had proven that the most effective forms of power were those that appeared to serve humanitarian purposes while actually advancing objectives that served her personal ambitions. The perfect crime that Evangeline had achieved through 10 successful marriages had transcended mere financial gain to encompass systematic acquisition of resources and influence that enabled operations extending far beyond anything that traditional criminal enterprises could accomplish. Her collection of deceased husbands had provided not only accumulated wealth, but also access to networks and capabilities that made her organization virtually undetectable while serving objectives that conventional law enforcement could never identify or counter. As she stood in the conservatory of her expanded estate, surrounded by portraits of her 10 beloved husbands, whose generous contributions had enabled her transformation from desperate orphan to global mastermind, Evangeline reflected on achievements that had exceeded her most ambitious early dreams. The husband collector had completed her education in the arts of systematic social manipulation and was now prepared to attempt operations that would make her previous accomplishments seem modest by comparison. The network that surrounded her possessed capabilities that enabled interventions in political, economic, and social processes that could reshape entire nations according to her will, while the resources at her disposal exceeded anything that conventional power could command. Her success had demonstrated that the most effective forms of control were those that operated through apparently beneficial activities that served humanitarian purposes, while actually advancing objectives that would ensure her dominance over civilizations that remained unaware of her influence. The perfect widow had achieved perfect crime through systematic application of matrimonial murder techniques that had evolved into comprehensive capabilities for social control that operated beyond the reach of any authority, while serving purposes that transcended conventional understanding of criminal ambition. Her collection would continue growing indefinitely, encompassing not only accumulated wealth, but also systematic expansion of influence that would endure as long as human civilization provided opportunities for elegant solutions to problems that conventional methods could never adequately address.